Good morning. My name is Charlie Baum, and today we're going to continue our discussion of comparative advantage by showing how individuals can benefit from trade. On this slide, we're going to assume that you have the ability to either pick apples or pick cherries with your time. And this graph shows us your production possibilities frontier. For example, it appears that you have the ability to pick either 20 apples or 20 cherries with your time. But you don't have enough time to pick 20 of each. If you pick 20 apples, you don't have any time left with which to pick cherries. And if you pick cherries, then you don't have any time left with which to pick apples. The production possibilities frontier in this graph shows us the maximum amount of apples and cherries that you can pick with your time. And of course, it's also possible for you to pick combinations of apples and cherries that lie along your production possibilities frontier, where you pick some of each. The table on this slide below shows us how many apples you can pick if you dedicated all of your time to picking apples, and how many cherries you could pick if you dedicated all of your time to picking cherries. And as we've discussed, you could pick a maximum of 20 pounds of each. We're also going to consider your neighbor. Let's suppose that your neighbor has the ability to pick 60 pounds of cherries if your neighbor dedicates all of her time to picking cherries, or 30 pounds of apples if your neighbor dedicates all of her time to picking apples. I'm going to show you this in a graph where we see your neighbor's production possibilities frontier. For example, this production possibilities frontier shows us that if your neighbor spends all of her time picking apples, she can pick 30 pounds of apples, but that would leave no time with which to pick cherries. So 30 pounds of apples corresponds to 0 pounds of cherries. But your neighbor could dedicate her time towards picking cherries. The production possibilities frontier shows us that if your neighbor does this, she can pick a maximum of 60 pounds of cherries. But of course that would leave no time with which to pick apples, and so the quantity of apples picked would be 0. We see this in the table below. If your neighbor dedicates all of her time towards picking cherries, she can pick 60 pounds of cherries, but this would leave no time with which to pick apples. I want to point out that the points along the green production possibilities frontier are also attainable. These correspond to uses of time where your neighbor would be able to pick some cherries and some apples. In this example, I want to examine what would happen if you and your neighbor each specialize in picking only that fruit for which you have a comparative advantage, and then engage in trading. Trade is going to be the act of buying and selling. And I want to show whether you and your neighbor could be made better off by specializing and then trading. In order to determine whether you and your neighbor would be better off with specialization and trading, I want to start at a point where you and your neighbor do not trade. And I want to start with this baseline level of consumption. We will compare consumption with trade to this level. In the diagram at the top of this slide, I'm going to assume that you are producing at point A, which corresponds to a point on your production possibilities frontier where you are picking 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries. I'm going to assume your neighbor is at point C, picking 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. Without trade, this production level will also be your consumption level and your neighbor's consumption level, so that if you and your neighbor do not trade, we're going to assume that you would have 8 pounds of apples to consume and your neighbor would have 12 pounds, and you would have 12 pounds of cherries to consume, and your neighbor would have 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. Now we're going to compare this point of no trade with your levels of consumption if we allow trade. On this slide, I'm going to assume that you specialize in producing only apples. Specifically, I'm going to assume that you are only going to use your time to pick apples. And if you do this, then according to your production possibilities frontier, you would have the ability to pick 20 pounds of apples. I'm going to assume that your neighbor dedicates all of her time to producing cherries, to picking cherries. And if she dedicates all of her time to picking cherries, she can pick a maximum of 60 cherries. So with specialization, you pick 20 apples and your neighbor picks 60 pounds of cherries. This isn't going to be what you consume because we're going to assume that you and your neighbor engage in trade. For example, let's suppose that you trade 10 pounds of your apples for 15 pounds of your neighbor's cherries. So here's where you started out with specialization. You picked 20 pounds of apples, then you traded 10 of those pounds of apples for 15 pounds of cherries. This meant that you ended up with 15 pounds of cherries because you traded for them, and you were left with 10 pounds of apples. That is from 20 pounds of apples that you picked minus 10 pounds of apples that you traded. So your consumption with trade can be represented by point B. You'll notice that point B is outside of your production possibilities frontier, and so this shows us that you are better off with specialization and then trade. You're able to get to a point like point B that was not attainable before you traded. In particular, point B has 2 more pounds of cherries in it and 3 more pounds of cherries in it and 2 more pounds of apples in it. Now let's consider your neighbor. Your neighbor started out by picking 60 pounds of cherries and then traded 15 pounds of those cherries to you for 10 pounds of apples. This meant that your neighbor ended up with 10 pounds of apples. This was obtained from a trade with you, and your neighbor ended up with 45 pounds of cherries to consume. Your neighbor picked 60 pounds of cherries, traded 15 pounds of them to you, leaving 45 pounds of cherries to consume. Consumption with trade for your neighbor can be represented by point D. Again, this corresponds to 10 pounds of apples and 45 pounds of cherries. Point D is outside of your neighbor's production possibilities frontier, and so this shows us that your neighbor is better off with specialization and trade because your neighbor can get to a point that was unattainable without trade. In particular, your neighbor is able to consume 1 more pound of cherries and 1 more pound of apples and 3 more pounds of cherries. This chart shows us the gains from trade. In the graphs on the prior slide, I showed that before trade, you consumed 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries, and your neighbor consumed 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. With production, with trade, you produced only apples and your neighbor produced only cherries. You traded 10 pounds of your apples to your neighbor for 15 pounds of your neighbor's cherries. And the result of this was you consumed 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries with trade, and your neighbor consumed 10 pounds of apples and 45 pounds of cherries with trade. This left you better off by 2 pounds of apples when we compare your consumption with trade to your consumption without trade, and you ended up with 3 more pounds of cherries. Your neighbor ended up with 1 more pound of apples to consume and 3 more pounds of cherries to consume. So this last row shows us gains from trade. It's the additional consumption which you and your neighbor are each able to attain with trade. I want to introduce two concepts. One is absolute advantage and one is comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is just simply the ability of an individual to produce more of a good or service than the other individual. Someone has an absolute advantage if they can produce more. In this example, your neighbor had an absolute advantage picking cherries and picking apples because your neighbor was able to pick more cherries than you and more apples than you. Comparative advantage is the ability of an individual to produce a good or a service at lower opportunity cost. In an example like this with two individuals, one of the individuals will be relatively better at producing one of the goods, and the other individual will be relatively better at producing the other good. If you are able to produce a good at lower opportunity cost than the other individual, then you have a comparative advantage at producing that good. I want to conclude by identifying what your comparative advantage is in this example and what your neighbor's comparative advantage is in this example, because this will explain why you picked the apples and why your neighbor picked the cherries. Your production possibilities frontier suggested that you could either pick a maximum of 20 apples or a maximum of 20 pounds of cherries. So the opportunity cost of picking each pound of cherries was 1 pound of apples, and the opportunity cost of picking each pound of apples was 1 pound of cherries. That's for you. For your neighbor's opportunity costs were different. Your neighbor had the ability to produce a maximum of 30 pounds of apples or 60 pounds of cherries. So the opportunity cost of picking each pound of cherries was half of an apple, and the opportunity cost of picking each pound of apples was 2 pounds of cherries. This information is summarized in this chart. If we look at the opportunity cost for apples, your opportunity cost is lower than your neighbor's. It's 1 pound of cherries instead of 2 pounds of cherries. So you will pick the apples because that's what you're relatively good at. Your neighbor's opportunity cost for picking apples, your neighbor's opportunity cost for picking cherries is lower than your opportunity cost for picking cherries in terms of apples. And so since this cost for your neighbor is lower, your neighbor will produce the cherries. The basis for trade is comparative advantage. If each individual produces that good for which they have a comparative advantage, then trade will be mutually beneficial. And here's the intuition for why. Comparative advantage gets individuals to produce more of what they're best at and less of what they're not as good at. In this example, you were relatively better at producing apples, and your neighbor was relatively better at picking cherries. So you spent all of your time picking apples, and your neighbor spent all of her time picking cherries, and the result was there was more consumption for both of you because you both were spending more of your time in those activities you were best at.